Ironeye is the Legolas of the Nightfarer realm. You'll slide around, look like a complete badass, and stab enemies in the back with your arrows. And in this Ironeye guide, we'll cover everything you need to know to maximize your damage output, including how weak point actually works, because I guarantee you're using it wrong. Let's go. So Ironeye really is the ranged powerhouse of the Nightfarers. Now, unlike some of the other Nightfarers that are a bit more flexible in how you choose to build them out each run, for pretty much every single run, you are definitely going to be using a bow, or to a lesser extent a crossbow or a great bow, because they have such low HP across the board. Now, there is a lot of gameplay elements that can help them avoid taking damage, namely their skills, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But ultimately here, your main focus will be on keeping that distance from enemies, but not going too far, because you want to stay within that maximum effective range for your bows, as you'll notice that there is actually weapon damage drop off if you are too far away. Now, because of the distance you can maintain with enemies, it's definitely one of the easier Nightfarers to master or to play, because there's a lot of melee range damage in Elden Ring Nightreign that you can just simply avoid because you're always in range. However, unlike Elden Ring base game, there is actually a lot of ranged mechanics and like targeted abilities that will target one of the Nightfarers, so you do need to be mindful of that and constantly be moving, like say using your marking skill as a movement ability, but there's better ways to use it. Attribute wise for the Ironeye, you start out with C, HP, and FP, and slightly higher stamina. Ultimately, for your overall stats, Dexterity is an A and Arcane is a B. Dexterity being A is the main stat you want to focus on here for anything. So any Dexterity-based weapons are the main focus, which is obviously bows, so there's not really anything that you need to think about too drastically there. But Arcane being B is fantastic as well because of that extra status build-up, which is fantastic for any bow build with Ironeye. All right, let's break down the skills, starting with the passive. Eagle Eye is the passive. A keenly observant eye discovers more items to obtain from foes. Something to note, this does apply to you and the rest of your allies as well, but it increases the odds of enemy loot drops on the ground. It doesn't change fixed drops, say like from chest rewards or boss loot, right? Those tables are still going to be the same. It's just that you'll get more loot drops from the random enemies as you're just fighting throughout the world. You'll notice they'll drop items more often. The main skill is marking, which will cuts forward with the dagger almost like a bloodhound step movement to damage the enemy and then apply a weak point. Now that weak point does two things. While the weak point is active on the target, it will lower the target's resistance to damage from all sources by roughly 10%. Now, as Ironeye, you can use like the aim down sights reticule to target that weak point. If you do so, you'll notice that the red aura of the marking will actually get darker red, and then eventually it'll like burst, which will create a stagger effect on the enemy and give you like a chunk of damage similar to like a blood loss. It won't knock them down immediately for a critical hit, but it will stagger them like a critical hit. So the main focus of marking, especially on bosses, is to trigger that effect as much as possible, especially on some of the harder bosses that have these unique mechanics that you want to knock them out of, which you can do by using this, marking them as a weak point, and then melting them as fast as you can, breaking that weak point for that extra damage potential. That's one of the key trade-offs that you get for Ironeye. Because you have that lower amount of overall damage because you are ranged, even though range is significantly more improved here than it was in Elden Ring, but essentially using this weak point mechanic to deal additional damage and then staggering enemies with that weak point break will make you a significantly better Ironeye player, and it's a huge difference between like an average Ironeye player that's either using marking just as movement ability, it is a great movement ability, don't get me wrong, or just say marking and then not bursting it. If you burst it as much as possible, you'll definitely see much more success. The ultimate here is single shot. Now this fires a powerful arrow that surpasses sounds and ignores any defense. What this means is that it pierces through all enemies, terrain, structures, absolutely everything. You can hold this down for a brief moment to lengthen the charge time. Charging it for longer doesn't increase its damage, but it does increase the invulnerability window, so you can avoid damage for longer, or if you need to say re-aim your shot, so you want to focus on a different enemy while you're just charging that up. A really good ultimate to use on like trash enemies, because it will basically one-shot them because it pierces through all of them in that like massive area. It's still good for bosses, but it's definitely not like one of the best for bosses. So I would definitely be using this throughout, like when you're trash clearing, or say if you're fighting a boss that has a lot of trash, you definitely want to make sure you're piercing through all that trash and killing them. It's also also great to revive allies as well because of the long range that it does have. You can hit the boss and revive your ally with it as well. While you're out on runs and expeditions, there's only really a couple of things that you need to think about as Ironeye because it's a very clear build progression for every single run. Firstly, when you're looking at the map, if you bring up the details, you can have the option to look at the various areas and see which areas have a higher chance of spawning bows, because that's exactly what you want to look for. So make sure when you are looking at the map, bring up the details, look for the areas that have a little bow symbol. They have a higher chance of spawning bows, and that's exactly where you want to go. While crossbows and great bows do work for Ironeye as well, the bow is typically faster and better to use because of its easier, like faster attack speed and just easier movement abilities around it. So I typically have always lent in that option. The great bow isn't bad to like clear trash because of the stagger, and then you could use a crossbow, but I've always just found them very cumbersome. While you're looking for weapons, try to find bows that have status effects, and don't be afraid to run multiple bows. Say for example, if you have one bow that applies poison, run that in your main slot, apply poison to the enemy or rot or frostbite, whatever status effect you have, and then switch to a bow that has a higher overall like physical damage output. When you're looking at bows and trying to figure out what works best, I've typically lent into bows that have weapon skills of rain of arrows or barrage. You won't use a lot of FP as Ironeye, especially with the others like say mighty shot. It's just kind of too slow and sky shot misses all the time. So it's better just then in those cases just to use your basic arrows, but with rain of arrows or barrage, you can easily get say status effects applied with barrage or a good amount of AoE damage with rain of arrows. Now look, you can melee if you want to. I just wouldn't recommend it because it's so hard to avoid damage as Ironeye, and just like making mistakes and taking damage will essentially one-shot you until you get to the higher level. So definitely be cautious about that. But if you want to melee, totally can. I just really don't think this is the character for you if you want a melee. It's all hard in on the bow. I have sometimes worn a melee weapon in my offhand, though what I would recommend for your offhand is to try and find items that have those equipped bonuses. For example, in one of the runs, I was able to get a shield that while walking would spawn lightning around me. Now, while you're aiming down sights with the bow and you have that reticule up, that's technically walking, so the lightning was spawning while I was using that. So try and find those combos with something in your offhand that has that like equipped bonus, and then you've also got that as well as whatever you're using in your main hand, which are typically two-hand because you need to two-hand to get that reticule aim down sights view. When thinking about the relics to equip for Ironeye, there's a few things to look out for. Firstly, getting Ironeye's Remembrance to 5 is hugely beneficial. This isn't too hard to do. Once you have done the first couple of remembrances, you will have to defeat a version of yourself on the map. Once you've cleared that and completed the remembrance, you'll get the Ironeye's Chalice, which is a relic combination that has a white slot, which can be then have anything equipped in it of any color, which is a really beneficial chalice to get very early if you are looking to play Ironeye. Now, in terms of the relics to equip, really there's a couple of things I would look out for. Firstly, anything that increases your overall dexterity. That's literally just increasing your overall damage by however much that dexterity increase is. Something that will add a ailment status effect to your starting weapon, like poison, for example, and then even other effects that lean into that. Say, for example, when poison is in the vicinity, increases attack power up when facing poison afflicted enemies. Anything that's like that, that adds those benefits, because there are plenty of bows you'll come across that have these effects on them. After you've beaten a few Night Lords, the jar vendor will sell you a Grand Lumio scene that has Ironeye extends duration of weak point on it, plus endurance and dexterity. Fantastic guaranteed drop once you've beaten, I believe it's 4 Night Lords, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Now, Ironeye's best relic does actually come from his remembrances, but it's one of the later steps. Now, Edge of Order is that relic. Now, it does boost thrust and counterattacks after executing art, which is fine, but the real thick kicker here is the improved bow attack power, which gives you almost 10 additional attack power just with your starting bow, and obviously that translates to any bow that you are using. The downside is that Ironeye's Remembrances is probably one of the hardest to complete. So to complete Remembrance Step 6, you need to beat the Dark Drift Knight as Ironeye with the Remembrance active. This is one of the hardest bosses in my opinion, but if you have a lightning weapon, it absolutely helps this encounter go a little bit smoother, as the boss is weak to lightning and it can stagger him out of his attacks. Now, after you've completed this, the final step of the Ironeye's Remembrance, you actually need to beat the Night Lord. Once you reach step 8, it's not actually a remembrance specifically, but that final step, you actually need to beat the Night Lord as Ironeye, and then there will be a additional option. I'm being quite vague here to avoid spoilers, but when you interact with the character at the end, there'll be an additional option which will complete Ironeye's Remembrance and give you a different ending to the game. And it's also not that bad of an idea while you're on a run to just level up Ironeye's bow, especially if you've got an affliction on that, like poison. You can then get these attack power bonuses up on your relic just by that bow. You've already know you've got a poison bow. And then anything that is like Ironeye specific, like the character skill that increases the duration of weak point. Things like that are definitely what you want to look out for in terms of relics. A couple of tips for Ironeye just generally on runs. Marking is a fantastic movement ability, but it's definitely not its main focus, and I would highly recommend to try and actually hit enemies with this. However, there are some bosses, especially flying bosses, that it's like almost impossible to hit them unless they do come to the ground. That's when I would be leaning into it as a movement ability, but its flexibility is what makes it really strong in that you can use it to get away. It has such a quick cooldown, but you mainly want to be hitting enemies with it and then triggering those staggers like we were talking about earlier. One of the other benefits to Ironeye is how heavy attacks now have like a shotgun blast of those 3 arrows. I would typically only be using this on the larger enemies that say you can hit with all 3 arrows. Like if you're using it on trash, it's typically higher damage just to use that single shot arrow. But if you're fighting larger enemies, using a charged heavy attack with those 3 arrow burst out, definitely better for those larger enemies where you can hit with all 3. Aiming down sights with that additional reticule does do slightly more damage than just the typical like locking onto targets and shooting your arrows. But something to note is that enemies that move around very rapidly, it's much better to just like lock yourself on and then just shoot at them, because the arrow will mostly auto target them. Whereas the reticule, because you have to aim it yourself, it is a little bit harder on those enemies that move a lot quicker. But definitely use that reticule aim down sights when triggering those weak point damage. It's much easier to do. And for other Nightfarers to come with you, I would highly recommend to get your allies to run a Raider or a Guardian. Especially a Raider is so beneficial to have with an Ironeye because of their ultimate that not only increases your overall attack power, but that tombstone, you can climb up to the top of it, you can stand up there. You can still get hit while you're up there, so you're not actually immune from damage. Be mindful of that, but you can then just wail on the enemies while you're up there. And that same advice is relevant to regardless of whether you have a Raider or a Guardian or whatever, right? Like high ground is so beneficial for the Ironeye. Anywhere that you can avoid taking damage, just stand still and pop shots at enemies is fantastic. That's really the benefit of Ironeye, is because of that range damage potential. And he's definitely one of my favorite characters. I've played him the most throughout the review period and have really been enjoying playing Ironeye, and I'm sure you will as well. But let me know in the comments, is Ironeye your favorite? Do you have any other Ironeye tips that I've missed? Put them down below so we can all help each other out. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.